I used to think the creek running through my land was nothing more than a quiet backdrop to my mornings. It wasn't wide, maybe only a few feet across, but the sound of water moving over the rocks had a way of settling everything around it. Birds perched along the trees nearby, and in summer, deer came to drink from it. It was nature's rhythm, simple and steady, and I never imagined anyone could look at that little stream and think of it as a problem. But that's exactly how the HOA saw it. They treated the creek like it was just another thing in their control. To them, water wasn't something natural, it was something messy, something they thought lowered the perfect image of their million-dollar homes. They'd send letters saying it attracted insects, that it looked unmanaged, and even went as far as claiming it might bring in wild animals. I ignored them at first. After all, the creek was on my land, and it had been there long before any of those homes were built. It wasn't a decorative pond I dug for fun. It was part of the land itself. But the HOA never liked to hear no. They thrived on rules, on flexing control, on forcing their version of beauty onto everything. When they couldn't get me to clean it up, they came up with a plan of their own. One morning, when I came back from a short trip, I noticed something strange. The sound of water was gone. Normally, I could hear the creek before I even parked, that gentle rush like background music. But that day? Silence. I walked down to the edge of the property, and I froze. The creek wasn't flowing. Instead, I saw gray streaks along the banks, thick and hardening in the sun. They had poured concrete into my creek. It wasn't just patched in one place. The entire flow had been blocked, covered in a slab like it never existed. My heart sank. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just about ruining a view. This was interfering with something nature had carved for years. I remember touching the rough surface, still damp in spots, and just shaking my head. Who does this? Who looks at a living stream of water and decides to bury it under cement? To the HOA, it was their version of progress. They thought it made everything look neat, like no stray water could ever inconvenience their perfect lawns again. They told the neighbors it would improve the neighborhood value. They even left a smug notice in my mailbox, saying it was necessary for community aesthetics. But all I could think about was what would happen the next time it rained. Water doesn't disappear just because someone decides to block its path. It finds another way, and when it can't flow where it's supposed to, it pushes back. I had grown up around land like this, and I knew that creeks don't just drain my yard, they drain the entire slope leading down from those houses. Without it, there was only one possible outcome: flooding. The thought of it left me sick, because I knew they had no idea what they'd just done. They were so focused on making everything look like a glossy magazine cover that they ignored the simplest rule of living near water. Respect it, or it'll remind you why you should have. That first night after seeing the concrete, I couldn't shake the silence. I kept stepping outside, half expecting to hear even a trickle, but the creek was gone. What once felt alive now looked like a construction site. I sat on my porch wondering how far they had really gone. Did they even think about permits? Did they sneak in workers while everyone was away? Or did they truly believe they had every right to rewrite the land itself? All I knew was the HOA had crossed a line. They hadn't just messed with me, they'd messed with nature. And soon enough, they were going to see what happens when you try to cage water. The HOA never even tried to hide what they did. In their minds, they weren't trespassers or vandals, they were visionaries. At the next board meeting, they bragged about how they had improved the landscape by covering what they called an unsightly drainage ditch. To them, my creek wasn't a creek at all. They refused to call it by its real name, twisting the truth so their actions sounded noble. They said it would prevent erosion, keep the neighborhood uniform, and make the entire community look more high-end. The words rolled off their mouths like they'd practiced in front of a mirror. I sat there listening, my jaw clenched, as they congratulated themselves. They spoke like they had fixed a problem, but all I could hear was arrogance. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't consult anyone with actual knowledge of the land. They didn't even acknowledge that it wasn't theirs to touch. To them, everything inside the neighborhood boundaries was under their control, even if the deed and survey maps said otherwise. When I brought up the fact that the creek was on my property, they brushed it off. One of the board members smirked and said, "Well, water doesn't really belong to anyone, does it?" Another chimed in, claiming that because the water affected the rest of the neighborhood, they had the right to take action. I felt my fists tighten under the table, but I kept my voice steady. I told them water wasn't just some decoration. They had blocked a natural drainage system. I warned them that heavy rain was coming in the next few weeks, and they had just set the stage for a disaster. They laughed. They actually laughed. One woman even said, "It'll be fine, stop being dramatic. You should be grateful we improved the view." Grateful? They had just destroyed something living and useful, and they expected me to thank them for it. I walked out of that meeting, but their smug faces stayed with me. The arrogance didn't end there. Within days, they sent out a newsletter to all the homeowners. In big, bold letters, it read, "HOA beautifies neighborhood with creek project." They posted pictures of the concrete slab, calling it a streamlined water management system. They claimed it was eco-friendly, maintenance-free, and a modern upgrade. I almost laughed at the absurdity, but the pit in my stomach grew heavier. I knew the truth, and soon everyone else would too. Neighbors started stopping me at the grocery store and along the sidewalks, asking why I was fighting the HOA about it. I told them straight, that creek wasn't just for show. It was there for a reason, designed by nature to move water out of our yards and away from our foundations. If it stayed blocked, the ground would start to hold water like a sponge. At first, they shrugged, saying the HOA must know what they were doing. But I could see doubt creeping into their faces. The worst part was seeing the change on my own land. Where water once flowed freely, puddles started to form along the edges. The grass near the slab turned soft and mushy, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. It was the first sign of what was coming, but the board refused to see it. They doubled down, acting as if their project was untouchable. They told homeowners that the only complaints were coming from me, and that I was overreacting. Every word they spoke added fuel to my frustration. I wasn't overreacting. I was watching years of natural balance get choked out by arrogance and concrete. I couldn't undo what they had done, at least not yet, but I could see the cracks forming, both in the ground and in their so-called authority. Because one thing I knew for certain, water never forgets its path. It would come back stronger, and when it did, no board meeting or smug newsletter could spin it away. It didn't take long for nature to respond. The first real test came with a light summer storm, nothing out of the ordinary, just steady rain over a couple of days. Normally, the creek would have carried it off smoothly, leaving the yards fresh and the air cooler. But with the water's natural path sealed under concrete, everything changed. I walked out one morning to see standing water pooling across the low spots of the neighborhood. At first, it looked harmless, like a few puddles after a shower. Kids even splashed in them, laughing as if it was just another rainy day. But I knew better. Those puddles weren't draining, they were sitting still, soaking deeper into the ground with every hour. The grass in my neighbor's yard turned from green to soggy yellow. Dogs splashed through mud that wasn't supposed to exist there. By the second day, the water hadn't moved an inch. It spread wider, seeping toward driveways and creeping into flower beds. The homeowners started to frown, confused at why their expensive landscaping suddenly looked waterlogged. They asked the HOA about it, and the board's response was the same smug dismissal as before. "It's just rain, it'll clear up." But it didn't clear up. The storm ended, the sun came back, yet the ground stayed heavy and wet. A sour smell rose where water sat trapped, and mosquitoes appeared almost overnight. By the end of the week, you couldn't take a walk without swatting them away. Neighbors started calling pest control, thinking it was a seasonal issue, but the truth was staring them in the face. The creek was gone, and the water had nowhere to go. I remember one evening, standing by the edge of the concrete slab, watching little rivulets of water struggle against the barrier. It was like watching nature push against a locked door. The force was quiet, patient, but relentless. And I knew this was only the beginning. Then came the second storm. This one wasn't light. It was a heavy downpour, the kind that sweeps through in summer with booming thunder and sheets of water hitting the rooftops. Within hours, those harmless puddles turned into shallow ponds. Driveways shimmered under a layer of water. Basements that had never seen a leak before began to feel damp. Neighbors who had once praised the HOA's improvements were suddenly on edge, peering out their windows at the swelling waterline. I watched as a family down the street tried to clear the water from their yard with buckets, like bailing a sinking boat. Another homeowner rushed to stack sandbags by his garage, cursing under his breath loud enough for half the street to hear. The panic was spreading faster than the water itself. When the rain finally stopped, the damage was clear. Lawns that once looked pristine were now mud pits. Decorative mulch had floated away, clogging storm drains. One unlucky neighbor found his newly built patio completely underwater, the bricks shifting as the soil beneath them softened. People began asking questions, louder this time, and the HOA's tone shifted from smug to defensive. At the next meeting, instead of boasting about their beautification project, the board scrambled to explain why half the neighborhood was soggy. They tried blaming the weather, saying the storms had been unusually strong. But everyone knew it wasn't true. We'd had worse storms before, and the creek always carried the water away. Now, without it, the land was suffocating. I sat in the back of the room, watching the cracks form in their confidence. Homeowners who once nodded along to every board decision now crossed their arms and scowled. They weren't siding with me yet, but doubt was spreading, and doubt is hard to silence. That night, as I walked home, I passed by the lowest part of the street. A car sat half buried in a puddle, the tires sinking into soft ground. The reflection of the streetlight shimmered across the surface, making it look less like a neighborhood and more like a swamp. The creek had been silenced, but the water hadn't gone anywhere. It was waiting, building, and every storm was only going to make it stronger. By the third week, the complaints were impossible to ignore. Homeowners who once praised the HOA's vision now couldn't step outside without sinking an inch into their yards. Lawns that had been the pride of the neighborhood, manicured to perfection, trimmed like magazine covers, were turning into marshes. Mailboxes leaned slightly as the softened ground swallowed their posts. The once perfect community was starting to look like it had been abandoned to the swamp. I tried once again to warn them. I stood in front of the HOA board, holding the survey maps, pointing to the natural slope of the land. I told them how the creek had been nature's drainage system, how it had carried runoff from all their homes safely past the neighborhood. I explained that blocking it wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. My voice was calm, but inside I was boiling. I reminded them that water never disappears. It only finds another way, usually one that people won't like. But they didn't want to hear it. The president of the board smirked, tapping her pen like she was humoring me. "You've made your point," she said, dismissing the evidence I laid on the table. "But the neighborhood isn't going to tear out a perfectly good project just because of a little mud. This is an improvement, not a mistake." A little mud. That's what she called it. Meanwhile, neighbors were already swapping stories about ruined flower beds, mosquito bites, and water seeping under doors. One man even showed up furious because his expensive wood deck was warping. Still, the HOA pushed the same narrative, that this was temporary, that it would pass. But the ground told a different story. With every rain, the sogginess spread farther. Cracks appeared in sidewalks where water pushed upward from below. Small sinkholes opened near driveways, swallowing patches of gravel. The smell of damp earth and mildew hung in the air, and the buzz of mosquitoes grew so loud at dusk it was hard to hold a conversation outside. Nature wasn't just giving warnings anymore. It was reclaiming what they had tried to erase. I began to notice something else too. The neighbors' patience was wearing thin, but their anger wasn't directed at me. They started turning on the board. People who once dismissed my words now asked me questions in hushed voices. Did the creek really drain all this water before? How much worse could it get? Some even admitted they hadn't realized what purpose it served until now. Their trust in the HOA was cracking, just like the pavement under their feet. One evening, after another round of heavy rain, I stood by the edge of the street and watched the water rising again. The road shimmered under an inch of standing water, reflecting the glow of porch lights like a sheet of glass. A neighbor walked over, his shoes squelching with every step, and shook his head. "This place used to be dry," he muttered. "Now it feels like we're living on a sponge." The frustration grew louder when mosquitoes became unbearable. Kids couldn't play outside without being covered in bites. Backyards became breeding grounds for swarms that rose in clouds the moment anyone disturbed the water. Pest control trucks rolled through every week, spraying chemicals that barely made a dent. Homeowners started sending angry emails, demanding answers from the HOA. And still, the board refused to admit they'd done anything wrong. They held firm, claiming this was a seasonal problem. They said it was unpredictable weather and told everyone to be patient. But patience was gone. The whispers turned into shouting matches at meetings. Neighbors demanded to know why their homes were suffering while the board sat behind a table, pretending everything was fine. I stayed quiet in those moments, watching the tension rise like the water itself. I didn't need to argue anymore. The swamp was doing it for me. Every flooded basement, every sinking yard, every mosquito bite was proof. They had ignored my warnings, but nature wasn't going to be ignored. And the next storm, the one already on the horizon, was going to make sure of that. The night the storm rolled in, the sky gave its warning long before the first drop fell. Clouds stacked heavy over the horizon, the kind that swallow up the sunset and turn everything gray. The air felt thick, buzzing with the kind of electricity you can sense on your skin. I stood on my porch, listening to the low rumble of thunder, and knew this was the moment I had been dreading. The creek had always handled storms like this with ease. It carried the water away, quiet and dependable. But now, with its path sealed under concrete, the neighborhood was about to learn what it meant to trap nature. The rain started soft, a steady patter against rooftops, then built into a steady roar. Within minutes, gutters overflowed, streams of water cascading down driveways. I walked toward the street and could already see the low points filling faster than before. Water rushed to the blocked creek and had nowhere to go. It spread, pushing into lawns, creeping across sidewalks, swallowing flower beds whole. By the first hour, it wasn't puddles anymore. It was a sheet of water stretching from one yard to the next. The storm showed no sign of letting up. Lightning cracked overhead, lighting up the neighborhood for split seconds, and in those flashes I could see the panic beginning. People waded out with shovels and buckets, trying desperately to guide the flow, but water doesn't listen to desperation. It moved with its own force, slow but unstoppable. I saw one family hauling sandbags from their garage, stacking them in front of their front door as the water lapped at their steps. Another neighbor stood knee-deep in his yard, yelling over the storm at the HOA president, who could only shout back excuses. The same board members who bragged about beautifying the neighborhood were now sloshing through floodwater, their umbrellas useless against the downpour. Inside some of those million-dollar homes, carpets darkened with creeping dampness. Basements began to leak, thin streams running down walls, gathering into pools. Expensive furniture was dragged upstairs, electronics unplugged, panicked calls made to insurance companies that gave little comfort. The sound of shop vacs and sump pumps mixed with thunder, as everyone realized too late what had been taken from them. And all the while, I stood by the slab where the creek used to run, watching the water push against the barrier. It spilled over the edges, swirling angrily, desperate to return to its path. The current carved small channels through the soft ground nearby, searching for escape. You could feel the pressure in the air, as if the land itself was groaning under the weight. By midnight, the neighborhood looked nothing like the glossy image the HOA had worked so hard to protect. Lawns were underwater, cars sat stranded in driveways, and the street itself had turned into a shallow river. Neighbors who once rolled their eyes at me now wore expressions of fear and regret. The HOA had promised beauty, but all anyone could see was destruction. When the rain finally eased, the damage was laid bare. The morning light revealed a neighborhood drowned in mud and debris. Sidewalks buckled, driveways cracked, and the air carried the heavy stink of stagnant water. Some basements were unlivable, carpets ruined, walls already stained with moisture. Foundations that had stood solid for decades were now under threat. And for the first time, the HOA couldn't hide behind excuses. Their project wasn't an improvement. It was the root of the disaster. Homeowners stood in clusters, soaked and furious, pointing fingers at the very people who once told them this was for their benefit. The president of the board tried to talk over them, insisting this was unusual weather. But her voice was drowned out by the rising anger of the crowd. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The creek had spoken louder than I ever could. The water they had tried to silence had made its return, and it had taken with it the image of perfection the HOA had tried so hard to create. And as I stood there, watching neighbors argue and blame, I knew this was only the beginning. The storm had shown them the truth, but the real fight was still ahead. The morning after the storm, the neighborhood looked like a battlefield. Lawns that had once been trophies of pride were now buried under inches of sludge. Cars stood tilted in driveways where the ground had softened and sunk beneath the weight of their tires. The air was thick with the sour smell of wet soil, rotting mulch, and mold creeping into basements. People walked around in rubber boots, shaking their heads, whispering curses, their perfect suburban dream washed away overnight. It didn't take long for the finger-pointing to begin. Homeowners gathered in driveways, voices sharp, faces red. Some were yelling at board members who were still trying to act in control. Others were frantically calling their insurance companies. But insurance didn't want to hear about it. Most policies don't cover man-made alterations that cause flooding, and once that phrase was spoken by an adjuster on speakerphone, the anger turned nuclear. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just a nuisance, it was the enemy. That's when I decided it was time to bring out what I had kept tucked away. For weeks, I had been documenting everything. Pictures of the creek before it was destroyed, videos of the water's natural flow, maps from the county survey office showing clearly that the stream ran across my property. I had even filed a complaint when I first saw the concrete, logging it with the city as unauthorized construction. The board brushed it off, but now? Now those papers weren't just proof, they were ammunition. I laid everything out, line by line, to a group of angry homeowners who gathered at my porch. They listened as I explained how the creek wasn't a decoration, but a functional drainage system recognized on county maps. I showed them the permits the HOA never applied for, the trespass they committed when they stepped foot on my land, and the legal protections tied to waterways that the board had completely ignored. Their faces shifted from shock to fury, the kind that doesn't fade quickly. Word spread faster than the flood itself. By the afternoon, city inspectors were on site, walking the ruined streets, snapping photos, and shaking their heads at the mess. One inspector knelt by the slab of concrete and muttered, "Whoever did this had no idea what they were dealing with." The board tried to spin their story, insisting they had acted for the good of the neighborhood, but the officials weren't buying it. They asked for permits, for engineering reports, for proof of authorization. The HOA had nothing. Neighbors stood by, arms crossed, watching the board squirm under the questioning. Some even shouted their frustrations openly. "You ruined our homes. We trusted you. You said this would raise our property values." The anger was no longer quiet. It was explosive. I stayed back, letting the evidence and the officials do the talking. For once, I didn't have to argue. Nature had already delivered its message, and now the paperwork sealed it shut. The board's arrogance crumbled as the inspectors explained the violations. Unauthorized alteration of a natural waterway, destruction of a drainage system, trespassing on private property. Each word carried weight, and each word pulled them deeper into the hole they had dug. One of the board members, usually smug and condescending, stood pale and speechless as the inspector explained how reversing the damage wouldn't be simple. The concrete couldn't just be chipped away. The creek would have to be restored carefully, with proper grading and environmental approvals. The cost? Easily hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. The homeowners erupted again, their anger now fully aimed at the board. People who had once voted them in were now demanding resignations, shouting that they should pay out of their own pockets. The board tried to calm the crowd, but their voices were drowned out by the storm of fury they had unleashed. As the chaos unfolded, I leaned against my porch railing, silent, watching it all unravel. I thought back to the sound of the creek that used to run steady and calm, and I couldn't help but notice the bitter irony. The HOA had silenced it with concrete, but in doing so, they had created a roar louder than any rushing water. And that roar wasn't going away anytime soon. The fallout hit harder than any storm. Once the inspectors filed their reports, the reality sank in. The HOA wasn't just in trouble, they were buried in it. The cost to fix what they'd done was staggering. Removing the concrete was only the first step. They'd have to bring in engineers to regrade the land, restore the natural flow, and reinforce areas that had been damaged by weeks of standing water. The estimates rolled in, and each number was higher than the last. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe even pushing past $1 million when it was all said and done. Homeowners who once sat proudly at HOA meetings now stared at their ruined lawns and sinking property values. Basements reeked of mildew. Walls were stained. Yards buzzed with mosquitoes that no amount of spraying could control. Realtors quietly whispered to their clients that selling in this neighborhood would be a nightmare, and buyers were already steering clear. These weren't just houses anymore. They were sinking investments, and the swamp was swallowing equity by the day. The anger turned into action. Lawsuits piled up, each homeowner pointing a finger at the board. Claims of negligence, misuse of funds, unauthorized projects. All of it was laid out in thick stacks of paperwork filed at the courthouse. Insurance companies refused to cover the damage, saying it wasn't natural disaster, but man-made interference. That left the HOA directly in the line of fire. The board that once prided itself on control now faced the possibility of personal liability. Their smug smiles were gone, replaced with tight lips and sleepless eyes. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was falling apart. Sidewalks shifted as the ground underneath refused to dry. Driveways cracked wider with each passing day. A couple of homes near the lowest point had sump pumps running around the clock, the steady hum echoing down the street like a reminder of the mess they couldn't escape. The smell of stagnant water mixed with the chemical tang of bleach as families tried to scrub mold from their basements. But mold doesn't care about bleach. It crept back, darker and stronger, feeding on the damp walls. Conversations that used to revolve around summer barbecues and community events now centered on anger and blame. Neighbors who had once been friendly avoided eye contact, their frustration too heavy to disguise. Children couldn't play outside without swatting clouds of insects. Dogs tracked mud into living rooms that had once been spotless. The very image of perfection the HOA had worked so hard to control had turned into a swamp, both literally and figuratively. The board tried to hold emergency meetings, but they were no longer in control of the room. Homeowners shouted over them, demanding resignations, demanding answers, demanding money. Some board members quit on the spot, unable to handle the pressure. Others clung to their seats, insisting they had only done what they thought was best. But no one wanted to hear excuses anymore. The damage was in their walls, in their floors, in their wallets. And through it all, I watched. My own property sat dry, untouched by the flooding, because I had never depended on the HOA's illusions of control. I had respected the creek, let it run the way it was meant to, and it had protected my land in return. Neighbors who had once dismissed me now looked at me differently. Some nodded in quiet acknowledgement, some avoided me out of shame. But I could feel the shift. The balance of power had changed. The lawsuits grew louder, the swamp grew wider, and the HOA's grip grew weaker. Their million-dollar homes now sat in mud and mosquitoes, their property values sinking just as fast as the water rose. What had once been their pride was now their prison, and no newsletter or glossy brochure could cover that up. By the time fall arrived, the neighborhood no longer looked like the glossy brochure the HOA once bragged about. The grass that had always been cut to golf course perfection was patchy, half-drowned, and streaked with mud. The trees along the streets leaned awkwardly where their roots had been loosened by months of standing water. At night, the constant hum of sump pumps blended with the high-pitched whine of mosquitoes, a soundtrack no one could escape. People kept their windows closed even in cool weather, afraid of the smell that clung to the swampy air. Whispers started to spread, not in meeting halls, but in hushed conversations between neighbors standing ankle-deep in soggy yards. They spoke of the board members like villains from a story, the ones who destroyed a creek for the sake of appearances. Some even joked bitterly that their expensive homes had become waterfront properties, except the water was brown, stagnant, and full of insects. What was once a place people paid extra to live in had become the kind of place buyers avoided without hesitation. The lawsuits kept crawling forward, slower than anyone wanted, but they hung over the board like storm clouds. Every envelope delivered to their mailboxes seemed heavier than the last. Every legal notice another reminder of the disaster they had created. The HOA tried to hold on, but their authority slipped through their fingers like mud. Resignations piled up until the board was nothing more than a couple of desperate faces trying to defend the indefensible. They blamed the weather, they blamed the city, they even tried blaming me, but no one listened anymore. I stayed quiet most of the time, letting the weight of the swamp speak for me. People would glance at my property, dry and safe, and I could see the realization in their eyes. The creek had always been a protector, not a problem. They saw it too late, but nature has a way of teaching lessons without mercy. The worst hit came when property values were reassessed. Million-dollar homes lost hundreds of thousands overnight. Realtors stopped taking calls from desperate sellers because no one wanted a house where water lapped at the foundation and mosquitoes ruled the yard. Bankers frowned at mortgage applications, hesitant to loan money on land that smelled of mildew and decay. Families who once boasted about living in one of the most exclusive communities now whispered about moving away, but they were trapped, tied down by homes no one wanted to buy. Every week, the swamp seemed to grow bolder. The waterline stayed high even when the skies were clear, the earth refusing to dry. Driveways buckled wider, mailboxes leaned further, and the roads carried hairline cracks like veins spreading across asphalt. Each sign was a reminder of what had been done, of how one reckless decision had unraveled an entire neighborhood. At night, when the air was quiet, I'd sit on my porch and listen. The creek was gone, silenced by concrete, but you could almost hear the land remembering where the water once flowed. It pushed back slowly, patiently, reclaiming its space. Nature doesn't rush, but it never forgets. The HOA had tried to control it, tried to cover it up, but in the end, the water was still there, waiting, pressing, reshaping everything around it. Neighbors stopped looking to the board for answers and started avoiding them altogether. They whispered instead, their voices carrying across the swampy yards, retelling the story of how their million-dollar homes had sunk under the weight of arrogance. They looked at the concrete slab where the creek used to run, not as a sign of progress, but as a scar, a reminder of the mistake that had turned their dream into a swamp. And though no one said it out loud, everyone knew the truth. The HOA had destroyed themselves. They tried to bury water under stone, but you can't bury nature. You can only fight it for so long before it decides to fight back. And here, in the middle of what was once their perfect neighborhood, the swamp was winning. The first winter after the creek was filled was unlike any the neighborhood had seen before. Cold rains turned the swamp into a shallow lake, covering lawns, driveways, and sidewalks with slick sheets of water. When the first freeze arrived, it didn't bring the usual quiet beauty of frost on rooftops. Instead, the water froze into jagged ice that cracked under tires, shattered under boots, and clung to the edges of homes like glass teeth. People slipped walking to their cars. Delivery drivers refused to step out onto porches where ice spread across steps like traps waiting to catch them. What had once been the pride of the neighborhood, the manicured green lawns, the glittering holiday lights, the perfect symmetry of cul-de-sacs, was now a half-frozen bog that swallowed decorations and shorted out power cords. Inflatable reindeer sagged into icy puddles, light strands flickered where water crept into outlets, and the reflection of holiday displays danced on the surface of the swamp. Families who once hosted big gatherings canceled parties, embarrassed by the smell of mold drifting through their homes and the standing water on their driveways. Children, who once rode bikes and played tag along the creek, found themselves shut indoors. Their parents warned them not to step outside without boots, afraid they'd sink into the muck or slip on black ice hidden beneath shallow water. Laughter that used to echo through the streets was replaced by the steady, mechanical hum of pumps working around the clock to keep basements from flooding. And even those machines struggled, choking on mud and freezing water until they sputtered out. The HOA, or what was left of it, tried to present itself as still in control. They sent out newsletters blaming unprecedented weather and promising vague solutions, but the neighbors weren't convinced anymore. The same people who had once blindly followed the board now rolled their eyes at the emails and stuffed the letters into trash bins without reading past the first line. The city inspectors began visiting more frequently, their clipboards filling with notes about erosion, damaged foundations, and unsafe conditions. Rumors spread that some of the houses might be condemned if things didn't change soon. The thought of it hung over the neighborhood like a curse. Million-dollar homes, once untouchable, now rotting faster than anyone could stop. The smell grew worse. Winter didn't hide it the way some had hoped. The swamp released a sour, metallic scent every time the ice shifted, carrying it down streets and into every corner of the subdivision. Residents sprayed air fresheners, lit candles, and ran purifiers, but nothing drowned it out. It wasn't just water anymore. It was decay. It was the earth reminding them of what had been stolen. Some nights, I'd see headlights weaving slowly along the flooded streets. Cars idled at intersections, drivers peering out at the rising water levels like they were checking the pulse of a dying patient. I could imagine their conversations inside. Should we move? Should we cut our losses? Could we even sell? But the truth was always the same. No one was buying. The HOA board members themselves weren't immune. Their own homes sat heavy in the swamp, walls creaking, driveways cracked, sidings streaked with mildew. They looked tired now, more like ghosts than leaders. I passed one of them at the store once, and the haunted look in his eyes said more than words ever could. He knew. They all knew. The creek had been more than just a ribbon of water. It had been balance. It carried away the excess, kept the soil alive, gave the land a rhythm. By choking it off with concrete, the HOA hadn't just silenced a stream. They had broken something much larger, something that wouldn't be easily fixed. Now, every season seemed like a punishment. Spring promised floods. Summer brought insects and rot. Fall revealed broken roots and leaning trees. And winter sealed everything in ice, turning the swamp into a frozen reminder of arrogance. The neighborhood was trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape, each turn of the year pressing the lesson deeper. Neighbors stopped waving at each other, stopped chatting in driveways, stopped hosting barbecues. Instead, they hurried indoors, pretending not to see the swamp creeping closer to their doorsteps. The sense of community had drowned along with the creek, leaving only silence and resentment. And in that silence, nature kept speaking louder than the board ever could. The swamp spread inch by inch, season by season, reclaiming the land. It didn't matter how many pumps hummed, how many sandbags lined doorways, or how many excuses were written into HOA letters. The water was still there. The land still remembered. And no one in that neighborhood would ever forget.